My firm represents people of all faiths, from a Native American sweat lodge to the Falun Gong. And when the government tried to ban a development of an Islamic cemetery, we fought and won for the Muslim community. As President Clinton stated on November 16, 1993, as he signed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, our founders cared a lot about religion, and one of the reasons they worked so hard to get the First Amendment into the Bill of Rights at the head of the class is that they well understood what could happen to this country, how both religion and government could be perverted if there were not some space created and some protection provided. We live in a pluralistic society with millions of Americans sharing differing views about family, faith, and conscience. In such a multicultural society, we must pursue tolerance and mutual respect. We can do this effectively without resorting to a zero-sum game of political power. Cooperation for mutual benefit is the goal. Coexistence with people of differing beliefs and backgrounds is the ideal. We must, as President Clinton urged us, explore how the First Amendment provides the space and protection we need for religious liberty to flourish in a pluralistic society. In United States v. Seeger in 1965, the Supreme Court had to interpret what Congress meant about the belief in a supreme being when Congress exempted conscientious objectors from compulsory military service. Taking a step back, it's quite remarkable that the state interest at stake is the very preservation of the state itself. But conscientious objectors have always received some form of protection since the Revolutionary War. Yet we as a nation, through our elected representatives in Congress, decided to exempt such objectors from compulsory service, even though doing so increased the possibility of another one among us bearing their burden, even the ultimate burden. And the Supreme Court in Seeger gave the fullest effect to that language, noting, quote, "It must be remembered that in resolving these exemption problems, one deals with the belief of different individuals who will articulate them in a multitude of ways. The validity of what he believes cannot be questioned. Local boards and courts are not free to reject beliefs because they consider them incomprehensible." Developments in the law of religious liberty bear mention and should serve as a guide for understanding the current administration's position regarding religious liberty protections. As Justice Brennan stated, concern for the autonomy of religious organizations demands that we avoid the entanglement and the chill on religious expression that a case-by-case determination would produce. As he further said, incorporation of presiding bishop versus Amos, I believe that a categorical exemption for such enterprises appropriately balances these competing concerns. Religious accommodation and exemption laws and their constitutional underpinnings have a long history in our country and a fully developed body of law. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is an excellent example of a broad religious accommodation and an exemption in that it applies to all federal law. While RFRA is broad in its application, it does not guarantee any particular outcome. It only ensures that people whose religious beliefs have been burdened get their day in court. RFRA asks whether the rule or regulation is a substantial burden on religious activity of the person seeking an exemption from an otherwise neutral and generally applicable rule. If the court determines that the person seeking the exemption demonstrates that the rule or regulation causes a substantial burden on his or her religious exercise, the burden of proof switches to the government. Protecting minority faith positions is the key to liberty for us all, because we never know when we will be in the minority faith position. This is why we stood for the Muslim community when all they wanted was a plot of land on which to bury their loved ones. Indeed, there are circumstances when members of the Muslim faith, for example, must refrain from participating in something that conflicts with their faith that may be a very important part of someone else's life. The question arises as to which branch of government should be the guardians of religious liberty. From conscientious objectors to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, Congress has been the guardian of religious liberty. Thus, the executive branch should defer to Congress, and that role is what the current administration appears to embrace. Many of the administration's newer proposed regulations hew very closely to the relevant underlying statutes as set forth by Congress. In fact, much opposition to this administration's regulatory changes comes from the administration's refusal to deviate from its statutory authority, even when past administrations were willing to reinterpret Congress's decisions. The First Amendment remains a meaningful guardian should government stray from its constitutional obligations. As the Supreme Court said in West Virginia v. Barnett, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. Thank you.
Mr. Sasser, Do you believe that the regulations proposed by the Trump administration seek to maximize individual liberty?
I think that the Trump administration is trying to focus on its duty as the executive branch to conform its regulations to Congress's decisions that they've made through legislation. Many of the regulatory changes that have been proposed or enacted were simply to try to bring the language back into conformance with statutes that this body had already previously passed. I'll give you an example. Since Title IX was raised, there was an issue in the previous administration with religious schools having to seek exemptions and having difficulty receiving their exemptions from Title IX because Congress said that religious schools shall be exempt. And in matter of fact, Congress was very specific. It was granting an exemption without having to go through all the jumps and hoops and everything else that the previous administration had enacted. And I think what this administration is trying to do is to conform its definitions and conform its regulations to the statutes that this body has passed. Congress, Article 1, branch of government, is the guardian of liberty. These are the representatives of the people of the United States from all parts of the United States and all different types of backgrounds. Obviously, there's going to be a difference between Waxahachie, Texas, and New York City. This is the place where those negotiations take place and that language is crafted. And it's not perfect. It's not what everybody wants. Somebody has to give a little bit here and there, as we all understand. That's part of that negotiation process. And I think that it does a disservice to ask the executive branch to try to go beyond the language that this body has negotiated.
Thank you. Can you explain the background behind your organization's support for eliminating unfair barriers for faith-based organizations?
Well, we represent people of all faiths, and in particular, anytime a particular viewpoint, religious viewpoint, is in the minority from the mainstream ideas of what is orthodox and what the mainstream, I think, is the right thing to do, there's going to be a lot of pressure on them, both social pressure and then political pressure and then ultimately legal pressure to change their mind, to conform their religious beliefs to what the larger public would like them to have. And I think it's the work of the First Amendment to protect those minority positions, and that's what we focus on. We focus on battling against government overreach into religious affairs, because we believe that what the promise that Thomas Jefferson made to the Danbury Baptists is true, which is that the government should not be interfering with religious entities and their beliefs.
I have one other quick question. How can we strive to make sure that the LGBTQ rights and the religious freedoms rights coexist?
The best way to do that is through the proper negotiation and congressional process that we have here, instead of asking the executive branch to do it by fiat, which is this particular administration doesn't appear to want to do.
As it relates to religious beliefs, just within that context, would it be fair to say that people with those deeply held religious beliefs literally practice what they believe? Everything else is just religious talk. But if it's a deeply held religious belief, they actually practice that.
Well, sure they do.
Okay. So is it also fair to say that when we're talking about religious liberty in America and the protections that we have under the First Amendment, that those are not just an issue of where I worship or how I worship?
Oh, it's part of their everyday life.
It's part of their everyday life. So an individual's deeply held religious beliefs go far beyond the walls of a church or synagogue or a building of faith. Those deeply held religious beliefs actually, literally, daily impact issues related to how that person works, play, their recreation, their politics, their family life, and their obviously their worship life. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. It's their entire life.
Okay, so with that, would you consider any attempts from government or otherwise that would prevent or disable people who hold deeply held religious beliefs from practicing those beliefs to be problematic?
Well, not only, I don't think that it's just that me that thinks it's problematic. Our founders thought it was problematic, and that's why they put in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution in order to protect religious liberty. And that's why this body passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in 1993 when they felt that the Supreme Court was not honoring the original meaning and understanding of the First Amendment.
So what you do on a daily basis is help defend people of faith who are increasingly in this country experiencing hostility, an environment, and we see it. I've dealt with this myself for 20 years plus, seeing an increase of hostility towards people of faith on multiple fronts. Would you consider it in and of itself discriminatory towards people of faith for government or other entities to come in and try to force those people with deeply held religious convictions to forsake those convictions or close the doors of their business or whatever it is that they're involved with?
Well, not only is it unconstitutional religious viewpoint discrimination, but I mean, there's entire bodies of law that support that.
So you would say that that is in and of itself discriminatory?
Well, sure it is.
All right. Your organization has called religious freedom the foundational right that all others are built upon. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, sure. The worst competition for a totalitarian form of government is for its people to believe in a power that's greater than government, and for people to have an allegiance to something that is greater than the government. I remember teaching at a law school, a seminar in Romania. It wasn't too long after the fall of communism there, but it had been some years. And the students found it quite remarkable that I would suggest that rights pre-exist government, and that there are certain foundational rights that are embedded not only in the Constitution, but are endowed by our Creator, as our Declaration of Independence acknowledges. And those rights pre-exist government, and any attempt of the government to impact those rights must be met with heavy resistance.
Can you provide some real-life examples of individual religious liberty being infringed upon at the expense, of another and others? And can you just go through some of the examples you guys have dealt with at First Liberty?
Well, sure. I'm one of the nearest and dearest to our heart, and one that we're working on very much so are the Jewish synagogues that are just north of New York City. And, just in the neighboring town of Airmont, New York, just neighboring Monsey, where they had the machete attack in one of the house synagogues there. Those communities are extremely hostile to the Orthodox Jewish community. And if you would see some of their campaign ads and some of the other things that they do, it's despicable that this is what's going on in this nation, and it's a difficult fight, and it's a fight that the Department of Justice has been waging in that area for almost 20 years, and we still have not been able to eradicate the anti-Orthodox Jewish community discrimination that is going on in that community. The religious discrimination is alive and well in this nation, and it takes vigilance to fight it.